She ran straight into the icy surf, ready to swim if the ship didn't stop for her, because for over a year she had genuinely believed no one was ever coming back. When the boat reached the beach, a stranger climbed down and asked her where the other 4 people were. She didn't have an answer he wanted to hear. She was the only one left. Her name was Ada Blackjack. For nearly 2 years, she survived completely alone on one of the most hostile islands on Earth, after every man sent up there with her either vanished or died. It's a story about a poor, terrified 23-year-old seamstress who was handed an impossible situation by men who barely thought about her at all, and who became one of the toughest survivors in Arctic history almost by accident. If you enjoy these kind of stories, don't forget to subscribe to Chronicles Unknown. Let's get back to it. Wrangel Island sits in the Chukchi Sea, roughly 90 miles off the Siberian coast, deep enough into the Arctic that for most of human history, nobody was entirely sure it existed. Indigenous hunters spoke of land to the north for centuries before any outsider found it. A Russian baron went looking for it in the 1820s based on their reports and never found it. It wasn't actually sighted until decades later by an American whaling captain who named it in the baron's honor anyway. Nobody lived there. Nobody could. It was a rock of ice and gravel with no trees, no shelter, and polar bears that treated the coastline as their own. That should have been the end of its story. Instead, it became the obsession of a Canadian-born explorer named Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a man with a gift for charm and an even bigger gift for convincing other people to risk their lives for his ideas. Stefansson already had blood on his hands from the Arctic. Years earlier, he'd led an expedition whose ship, the Karluk, became trapped in ice near this very island. Stefansson left the vessel early, claiming he was going hunting, and never came back to it. The Karluk was crushed and sank. 11 of the 25 people left aboard died before rescue ever came. It remains one of the most controversial disappearing acts in the history of polar exploration. You would think a man responsible for that would stay away from Wrangel Island for the rest of his life. Instead, in 1921, he went back for it, this time not to explore it, but to claim it. His theory was almost embarrassingly simple. International law rewarded occupation. Put people on a piece of land long enough, and the claim holds itself. Wrangel Island, he argued, could become a base for trans-Arctic flights, a weather station, a foothold for the British Empire in the north. All he needed was a handful of people willing to sit on it for a year. He recruited 4 young men, only one of whom was even Canadian. Allan Crawford, 20 years old, was named leader specifically because his nationality made the claim legally cleaner. The other 3 were all Americans, recruited for their skills, not their passports. 28-year-old Fred Maurer had already survived the Karluk disaster once and, for reasons only he could explain, wanted back in. Lorne Knight, also 28, was the most Arctic-hardened of the 4, confident in a way that would prove to be either very useful or very dangerous. And then there was 19-year-old Milton Galle, Stefansson's secretary with no wilderness experience, brought along only because the other 2 had taken a liking to him. Restless, eager to prove himself and about to find out what that would cost. What none of them could do was cook, sew, or turn animal skins into clothing that could actually survive a Wrangel Island winter. For that, they needed someone else. They needed Ada. Ada Delatuk was born on May 10, 1898, in a small settlement near Solomon, Alaska, a place where the weather wasn't scenery, it was law. Her father died when she was still a child. Her mother sent her and her sister to a Methodist mission in Nome, where Ada learned to read, learned to write, and learned to sew. A skill nobody in that mission thought was particularly important at the time. It would end up being the only reason she was ever hired for what came next, and quite possibly the reason she survived it. At 16, she married a musher named Jack Blackjack, a dog sled driver, someone who made his living getting a team of huskies to obey him. The marriage was violent. He beat her, starved her, and eventually abandoned her out on the Seward Peninsula with one surviving child out of 3, a son named Bennett. Ada walked the 40 miles back to Nome carrying him when his legs gave out and took any work she could find, cleaning houses, sewing for miners, anything that paid. It still wasn't enough. Bennett had tuberculosis, and the only way Ada could afford treatment was to place him in a children's home and pay for his care from a distance, telling both herself and him that it was temporary. In 1921, word reached her that an Arctic expedition needed a seamstress. The pay was $50 a month, more money than Ada had ever been offered for anything in her life. She wasn't thinking about flags or empires or air bases. She was thinking about a sick 8-year-old boy in an orphanage and a number that might finally be enough to bring him home. She was told other native families would be joining the expedition, that she wouldn't be the only woman, wouldn't be alone with 4 strange men on a frozen rock at the edge of the map. That promise mattered almost as much to her as the money did. On the morning they were due to leave, none of those families showed up. Ada nearly walked away from the dock. The men reassured her that they'd find others once they reached Siberia before continuing onto the island. She believed them and got on the ship anyway. They found no one to bring along. On September 9th, 1921, Ada and the 4 men boarded the schooner Silver Wave, along with a small mascot cat they'd named Vic. The ship carried them out of Nome and north toward the island into water that grew colder with every mile. They reached Wrangel Island in mid-September and raised a flag over ground that had never had a permanent resident in all of human history. Ada watched the ship that brought them turn around and vanish over the horizon without her. She turned her face away from the men so they wouldn't see her cry. The first months held together more or less. They reinforced their tent with driftwood and banked snow against its walls, keeping a stove burning at its center like a heartbeat. Ada did most of the labor that actually kept 5 people alive, cooking, hauling fuel, scraping hides, sewing new gear from animal skins that could resist the wet and hold in warmth. The men hunted with mixed success. They trapped foxes. They took notes for Stefansson's scientific record. In the evenings, there were moments almost worth calling pleasant. Bad jokes, invented poems, a cat weaving between everyone's legs looking for a lap. But 4 young men who had never had to answer to a woman treated Ada exactly the way you'd expect. She was mocked. She was distrusted. When she once refused an order, Lorne Knight tied her to the camp's flagpole and left her there until she gave in. It wasn't discipline. It was a demonstration, a plain, deliberate reminder of exactly where he thought she stood in his world. And she was afraid, constantly, of something none of the men fully understood. Polar bears wandered near camp at night, close enough that the line between outside and danger simply stopped existing after dark. More than once, Ada sat alone in the tent, listening to something enormous breathing just beyond the canvas, waiting for men who might not come back in time. Then the real trouble started, the kind that had nothing to do with bears at all. The relief ship that was supposed to reach them in the summer of 1922 never came. Pack ice blocked the route north. There was also a colder, more political problem sitting underneath it. The Soviet Union had its own claim on Wrangel Island, and Stefansson's Canadian backers had no appetite for provoking a diplomatic incident over a rock in the Chukchi Sea. Whatever the exact mixture of ice and politics, the outcome for the 5 people on the island was the same. No ship came, no mail came, no proof that the rest of the world still existed came. 6 months of food had to somehow stretch into a year's worth. It couldn't. Coffee ran out first, then tobacco, then the small comforts that make isolation bearable. Then it started taking the things that keep a body alive. Scurvy moved through the camp the way cold moves through a poorly built wall, slowly and then all at once. Gums swelled and bled, joints ached, bruises bloomed under skin for no reason at all. The only real defense was fresh meat, and fresh meat depended entirely on hunting that had never been especially reliable to begin with. By January 1923, the 4 men had one plan left between them: cross 90 miles of unstable sea ice to Siberia and walk from there to a wireless station that could call for rescue. It was a desperate plan. It was also, by that point, the only one they had. Lorne Knight was too sick with scurvy to make the crossing. Someone had to stay behind and care for him. That someone was Ada, a woman who had never been taught to hunt, who was still quietly terrified of the animals patrolling the coastline, now left completely alone in the Arctic with a dying man who, by his own diary's account, barely tolerated her. On January 29, 1923, Allan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Galle loaded the sled and walked out onto the ice towards Siberia. Ada watched them until the white distance swallowed them whole. No trace of any of the 3 men was ever found again. What Ada did over the next several months is the entire reason anyone still tells this story. She rationed what food remained down to a handful of dry bread pieces a day. She taught herself because there was no one left who could teach her how to set a trap that actually worked, how to fire a rifle without her hands shaking, how to track, kill, and clean an animal efficiently enough that nothing went to waste. Every one of those skills, the kind her own ancestors would have considered basic survival, she had to learn from scratch. Lorne Knight did not make it easy. Sick, frightened, and slipping fast, he criticized nearly everything she did. How she skinned a hide, how she rationed the food, how she moved through a day that was keeping them both alive. Ada, who had spent her whole adult life being talked over by men, finally told him plainly that she would do things her own way from now on. It wasn't really about hide-scraping technique. It was about who got to make the decisions that decided whether they lived. He died in late June 1923, hollowed out by a disease that has a cure so simple it's almost cruel. Fresh vegetables, citrus, anything her ancestors would have known to eat, and that Wrangel Island simply did not have. Ada couldn't drag his body far. She built what barrier she could around it to keep the animals off, and then she kept working, because stopping was the same thing as lying down next to him. She was now completely alone, with nothing living beside her but a small cat that had somehow survived 2 Arctic winters purely by sitting close to whoever was still breathing. She kept hunting. She kept checking traps. She built a boat from scavenged wood and skins, lost it to the wind in a single afternoon, and started building a second one, because a boat meant seals. And seals meant enough fat stored away to survive a 3rd winter if it came to that. Every clear day, she climbed to a lookout point above the camp and searched a horizon that had betrayed her once already. On August 19th, 1923, the fog finally broke long enough to reveal a mast. Ada ran for the beach so fast, she said later she felt like her legs weren't her own. She waded straight into the surf, ready to swim out to the ship if it didn't come close enough on its own. A man named Harold Noyce climbed down to meet her. He had been sent north by Stefansson, expecting to find 5 survivors waiting on the shore. He found one, thin, dressed head to foot in furs she had made with her own hands, her face weathered by 2 years of cold and work that should have killed her a dozen times over. When she finally understood that she was the only one left, that Crawford, Maurer, Galle and Knight were all gone, the composure she had held together for months finally broke. She collapsed on the sand and wept. Back in the United States, newspapers didn't quite know what to do with a story like hers. Some called her a heroine, a female Robinson Crusoe. Others, working off rumor and selectively read fragments of Lorne Knight's own bitter journal, accused her of letting him starve to death. The accusation never held up, but it followed her for years anyway. It was easier for some people to believe that than to accept the plain truth. A poor, self-taught indigenous woman had simply outlasted 4 trained men through sheer refusal to quit. Ada never got rich off of what she survived. What little money it brought her went where it was always meant to go, toward Bennett's treatment. She remarried and had a 2nd son and spent the rest of her life mostly out of the spotlight she'd never wanted in the first place. Bennett survived into his 50s before the tuberculosis that had shadowed him. His entire life finally took him in 1972. Ida outlived her own son by more than a decade. She died in 1983 at the age of 85, back home in Alaska, a long way in every sense from the wind-scoured beach where she once ran into freezing water because she believed with everything she had left that no one was ever coming for her. Her gravestone in Anchorage carries 4 words: Heroine, Wrangel Island Expedition. It took the state that failed to protect her decades to officially say even that much. If you strip this story down to its bones, it's tempting to make it sound like a clean, simple triumph, the last one standing. That version misses almost everything that actually happened. Ada wasn't sent north because anyone believed she'd become a legend. She was sent because her sewing could keep other people warm, and because poverty left her almost no room to say no. When she was asked, years later, what actually kept her alive out there, she didn't talk about courage or willpower. She talked about her son. She had to live because somebody was still waiting for her to come home. Wrangel Island took almost everything from Ada Blackjack. Her will to get home to her son wasn't one of them. If you want more of the stories a history left out in the cold, the people who did the impossible and were barely remembered for it, subscribe to Chronicles Unknown. The next unknown chronicle is already waiting.